For decades, Canada's first past the post electoral system has forced Canadians to vote strategically while governments get 100% of the power with only like 30 something percent of the votes. Millions of Canadians feel like their voice doesn't matter. But what if there was a better way? In our last video, we did a deep dive on the importance of electoral reform in Canada, and we showed that we're just as vulnerable to democratic collapse as our neighbors to the south. This video is about getting into the nitty-gritty detail of different electoral systems in Canada, and today I'm joined by Ted Cragg from Fair Vote Canada to help us understand different proportional representation systems and why it matters and how it could transform our democracy for the better. So, whether you're a political junkie or just someone who cares about making your vote matter, this conversation is for you. Let's get into it. I'm Aaron Heggie McKay, and welcome to the Goose. Well, we are talking today about proportional representation, and joining us today is Ted Cragg from Fair Vote Canada. Ted,
Hello.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Ted Cragg. I'm a longtime volunteer with Fair Vote Canada. Fair Vote was founded in the early 2000s as a way to organize people, essentially, to start lobbying for electoral reform, and really to help educate and get people to understand how it works and the different options. And even, frankly, for us, like volunteers over the years, to figure out how to talk about it, and for us to help to be able to learn how it all works too. Because it really comes back to the fact that we're just not familiar with proportional representation and different voting systems in Canada. I mean, we've always voted the same way. And I can say for sure we definitely feel a lot of momentum over the last 10 years.
I do see that 68% of Canadians support proportional representation. So the momentum is definitely on your side.
Yeah, we could feel it.
Like but 10 years ago, Trudeau proposed the idea of changing the electoral system and got elected on that in part. But there's about 20% of the people right now who oppose changing our electoral system. So for those who are like in between the either like they support it or they oppose, the rest of it, for like, I don't know, I guess the other 20% or 15%, whatever it is, I'm terrible with math. For the people who are like, I don't really know what this is, they might ask you like, well, why can't we just have like the progressive parties merge?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Well, because that's one response, and especially in a world of first past the post, where it's winner take all, you get the vote splitting again, something we're all quite used to, voting strategically. Voting for the person you don't like, so the person you really don't like doesn't win.
Yeah, the person you hate least.
Yeah. So what's one response to that? Well, you should have a single party, let's say on the left, a single party on the right. It's one or the other. It's black or white. People choose that way. Is that really the type of democracy that we want? Does that reflect our society, especially in like the 2020s here? We're a very pluralistic, multicultural society. Of course, a very huge country. There's regional differences, people with all kinds of different priorities and interests. And can that really be reflected in one of two parties? And so to merge parties that somewhat seem familiar with each other or on a similar length, but we've talked to a lot of liberals and NDP federally and even provincially, and they say, well, we have less in common with each other than people think. So there's quite different cultures within those parties, and that's just an example. You could talk about the Green Party or the People's Party merges with the Conservatives or something like that. These parties exist for a reason. So to force them to merge is really quite anti-democratic. And we know what that looks like because we just look south of the border. Essentially, it's a two-party system, and everything that merges into these big tents. That's the end result of a two-party system, which can happen under first past the post. It was designed for that. First past the post was designed in England in the 1800s under a world where only white men of certain wealth could vote, and there were two parties, and it hasn't changed ever since. Even in the UK, at least federally, especially here in Canada, we live in a system designed for a completely different age. So that's why we need something more modern.
Yeah, it seems to me that we were basically running on really outdated software for our democracy. It's like there are smarter people who have been looking at this instead of just like some guys wearing wigs in the UK being like, well, we can vote for this and that's democracy. So let's dive into a couple of systems. So I think we're all kind of familiar with, you get one vote in your riding and you vote only for your MP, and the party that wins the most seats
Yeah,
typically forms the government. We're used to that.
that's right.
In proportional systems, sometimes you get like these regions that have like you can vote for a whole bunch of different people and a whole bunch of different members can be in a region. Explain how, like I'm five, like
Okay.
what the basic idea of these systems is.
There's a fundamental concept to proportional representation that explains essentially how it works, and that is that you're electing more than one representative. So keep that thought in your mind, because the way it works right now, we elect one representative. They're a local riding, and that's it. There's no other. We don't elect the prime minister. We elect our local MP, right? In proportional representation, you're electing at least two representatives. So then the question is, well, how do you divide that up, and how do you set up a system that has two representatives? That's where you get into these different systems. So it can be a local representative and then a broader regional representative. So when you go to an MP for help, you need help with something or someone to vouch for you, you have two options. You have your local rep, as we do now, and then your broader regional one. They may come from a different party. They may be from the same party, maybe somebody you know, but you have that option. You have now two representatives. An open list refers to a list of candidates, and we call it open because the voter gets to choose which candidate represents the party in a party seat or a regional seat. The closed list is if you're voting for the party, but it's the party that chooses who from their party will occupy that seat. So if it's an open list, the voter gets to choose not just the party they like, but the person who represents that party to sit in that seat. Now, that does mean the voters need to be more familiar with more names, more candidates, and a lot of countries use a closed list system. New Zealand's a good example. They have a mixed member proportional system, and that means they have local representatives, and then they have basically regional representatives who come from a party. So when you go to vote in New Zealand, this is an example of a New Zealand ballot. When you go to vote, this is what it looks like. You have two sides to the ballot. There's the party vote here on the left and the local vote, the electorate vote, on the right. Now, on the left side, you're voting for your party representative, and they kind of occupy like a regional seat. So you can see also, if you like the Cherry Party, you just put an X next to the Cherry Party, but that means you don't get to decide who actually occupies that seat if they win. So that's the closed list. And the open list means that you would not only see the parties, you'd see a list of names within they've been selected, nominated by that party. The voter can choose not just the party they like, but the person who would occupy that seat from that party. Again, gives more accountability. So that's the open list. There's other systems that take, say, especially in more densely populated urban areas, that say instead of three ridings, each with their own representative, you group those into one riding with three representatives. Same number of politicians, but now you're electing three people instead of just one. That makes the ridings larger, but you don't have more politicians, which is always a popular thing. So that's the fundamental difference with proportional representation. If you look at every country that uses that, they have different levels of representation. And that's what equates the popular vote as closely as possible to the seat count in the legislature. And that's another fundamental thing, right? Because we think about elections when you see it in the polls, and then that turns into the vote, the popular vote, and such party won 35% of the popular vote, but they ended up with maybe a majority. I mean, 48% of the seats or something like that. It's vastly skewed. So we want a system where we think about how people vote and what the popular support is. 40% of the votes should be 40% of the seats. Party gets 12% of the votes, they should get 12% of the seats. How do you set that up in a country as big as this, where you're electing a legislature? The best way, the closest way to do it is have multiple representatives, and that helps to kind of balance out those discrepancies.
And of course, just as a basic principle, proportional representation, as you were saying, the number of votes that a party gets is reflected as closely as possible to the number of seats in the House and the amount of power.
That's right.
I got first involved in the first idea that our electoral system is maybe not the best was around 2007, and I got involved a little bit in the mixed member proportional campaign, which again died in referendum here in Ontario. Dalton McGuinty put it up to a referendum, and the people were just like, "What is this?" It was like, I think for most people, it was like they show up and they're like, "Wait, there's another. What is this thing?" And it's like, "Do you want to change the electoral system?" I don't know, man. It was a little bit disappointing. But when I got into it, I'm like, oh yeah, this mixed member proportional thing does seem fairer. Why do people like this?
Well, it's because it keeps your local representation, but adds that extra regional level. So a standard way that it would be done is that you keep your local ridings. Now you might have a few less. They make them a bit bigger so that you'd have that extra level of regional representation. In a city as big as Toronto, well, there may be more regional representatives than in more rural areas. Either you make those local ridings a little bit bigger so that you have fewer local but more regional, and that means you don't have a whole bunch more politicians in the legislature at the end. You get that local connection, and that's really what people like, and that's what we want to keep in Canada, that you have that connection to your MP, your MPP, etc., and they're not some person way off in some distant place.
Great. And Germany uses this system. They just had an election.
Yeah.
Things went definitely to the right in Germany. Alternative for Deutschland. They're essentially neo-Nazis. What if the crazy people take over or whatever,
Yes.
like the alternative? Is that a problem with the system itself, or is that actually just, could it have been worse?
It could have been worse. Imagine if Germany had a winner-take-all system and the alternative for Deutschland there was able to take over one of the kind of mainstream, let's say, center-right type parties, maybe kind of weaseled their way in there. Could have taken a few years, but eventually those people become the leadership of that party, that then in a winner-take-all first-past-the-post system, well, they might get 38-40% of the vote. That would be a majority government under the way first-past-the-post works, so they get well over 50% of the seats, and now they have 100% of the power. That's far more dangerous than a fringe party that might get 20% of the vote, 20% of the seats, but that's 20%. That's not 100% of the power. So that's the danger of first past the post, and we see it in the States in the Republican Party. I mean, look how much has changed over the last 10 years or so, right?
In the last 10 minutes, man. Like every time I look at my phone, it's just
Every
another
day.
parade of horrors.
So, yeah, we absolutely can argue that it is more dangerous to democracy and, I mean, society, that you extremists, they figure this out. They can find a way to integrate themselves in established parties, and people don't necessarily know the difference. They see the name of that party, they see his logo, its history, and all that kind of stuff. They think they're voting for the same Republican Party that they voted for 20 years ago. They should know better now. But still, that's how this works in the majoritarian winner-take-all system. When you have proportionality, those votes are still going to be there. I mean, if you have a problem with neo-Nazis, that's not going to change depending on what system you have. It's marginalizing their vote and their influence so that they don't have overdue influence that they certainly don't deserve and they haven't earned.
Let's move on to single transferable vote.
And I'll give this one a bit of extra credibility too, because in British Columbia in 2004, they had a provincial citizens assembly on electoral reform, which is another thing we should talk about. But that's where everyday kind of citizens get together. They're chosen to be on an assembly. They learn different systems. They make a recommendation. That's what happened. And they recommended a single transferable vote system for British Columbia because it's arguably the most effective way to really get as much proportionality and reflect the wishes of voters. That's the example of when I said earlier, you take, say, 3 ridings and group them into one. That's a single transferable vote system. But then it's also how the vote is tabulated, which does involve some math. You have to have a quota of a percentage of the votes that determines how people get elected. It's not just kind of a solid number. There's percentages, but there's programs, there's ways to do this, and there's computer programs and stuff that can figure out the voting. We don't have to understand how our car works in order to be able to drive a car, right? What you do have to understand is how to turn the key and put it in drive. When you're voting an STV, you understand that you rank your choices from 1 to 3 or 4 or 6 or however many you want to. The neat thing with the STV is that it doesn't waste any votes. And that's the reason why I like it. So because you have this quota and it says that a candidate needs, let's just say, for example, 33% to get elected for one of those seats. You say you're electing 3 candidates. Once they get past that threshold, they don't need any more votes. So all the people that have selected somebody as like their first vote, if they got too many votes, then each ballot is transferred. This is where you get the transfer part. The extra votes are transferred to other selections on their ballot. And when you see it play out in the results, people have the fewest votes, they drop off the ballot. and those votes are transferred to. At the end of the day, you end up with, if you're electing, say, 3 people, they have clearly got the support from as wide range of people as possible, and that's what you want. So it doesn't waste any extra votes, because in our system here, if someone wins with a dominant majority of votes, well, good for them. They got lots of support, but they didn't need that many, right? It's the concept that you make the ballot work as long as possible.
There we go. So So the difference between that and, say, instant runoff or alternative vote that Justin Trudeau was proposing. Take us through that.
Yes. So there's different names for it. People say ranked ballot, alternative vote, instant runoff. They're only electing that one person. It's not proportional because it's still one representative per riding. There's no extra levels, no regional. You're not grouping ridings together, anything like that. It's still basically winner take all. But yeah, it makes the ballot work a little bit harder because if the first choice is eliminated, then they take your second choice and stuff like that. But you still end up with a final result that's not proportional to the polls and the popular vote, which is what we look for, right? And the real tactical or kind of tangible result of this is, how does that play out, right? Especially in Canada. I mean, we can be hypothetical, but there's also kind of the reality that what's the party that's going to appeal to the widest range of voters? Is the party that's probably the most centrist, because you might get a voter that chooses someone more left-wing on the first, just as a chance that person might win. But if that person doesn't win, they'll probably choose the most centrist party as their second choice instead of something that's more right-wing. Or even if you voted for your first choice is someone more right-wing, just to see if they could win. If they don't, well, what's your second choice? Probably the party is more centrist. What in Canada is traditionally the most centrist party, left versus right, probably the Liberal Party. So they would get most of those second, third votes. And that means that tangibly that over time, the NDP, let's say, or if there's an alternative on the right, maybe that's the People's Party or something, over time, they're not going to be very competitive. They'd have to really, really be strong in very concentrated areas just to win any seat, because they're not going to have enough of that kind of broad support. It really appeals to like centrist, big tent parties. The NDP and other small parties over time would say, well, what's the point? We might as well just merge into these big tent parties, right? Because we're not winning any seats anyway. We don't have any chance in this system if we adopt and change our policies, which of course are the things that we believe in. We're just going to be liberals or maybe conservatives in another name, right? So you end up with a big party, two big tent, big party system, which essentially is, again, what they have in the States. And that's what would happen here.
And so there's kind of no, what you're saying is that it essentially devolves into not really ranking. It's just sort of one or two. But I think if I was to play, Justin Trudeau in this argument, he might say something like, well, playing to the middle is a good thing, right? I mean, maybe we should have an electoral system that forces everybody into the middle instead of having a wide range of disparate voices that can sometimes cause a lot of chaos. Why not, peace, order, and good government? That's our motto.
Sure.
The Liberal government is always the best from his perspective.
Okay.
Is that even worth talking about?
Well, I mean, that's their argument for sure. I would rather let voters make that choice than party strategists and some policy convention and so on who's making those decisions within a party, and therefore you have to be a member and be a participant and so on. I would rather see voters at the ballot box choose the parties that reflect their values and their priorities, and let the politicians then sort it out in Parliament, basically, and again, tangibly in some kind of coalition power sharing deal. That reflects democracy, not a big tent party deciding what goes, basically, and not giving voters a choice.
You're right. Like, if you concentrate too much power in the parties and the people don't really end up having a choice, then who are they really accountable to?
There's very little accountability. And imagine, voter participation goes down, and now we seem to be living in an age of populist revolt and stuff. Like, at what point does someone try to take over and say, well, there's got to be,
democracy's not working.
Yeah, things aren't working, and then you start to get the kind of upheaval that we see in the States now.
So the last system that I wanted to talk about is something that I, again, had never heard of until I started talking to you and the Fair Vote people, which is rural-urban PR, which seems kind of tailor-made to Canada.
I'm going to need some visuals.
Thank you.
This is on our website. You can go to Rural Urban Proportional. There's a page for it. And our example here is Alberta. The point of rural urban is that it really reflects the reality of Canada, that we have very densely populated urban areas, and then very sparsely populated, spread out rural areas. So how do you get enough basic representation and proportionality without creating either huge districts or a whole bunch more politicians, basically, to represent these more sparsely populated areas? So Alberta is an interesting example because, you have a kind of a corridor of the most densely populated, Edmonton, Red Deer, Calgary, versus the whole rest of the province. I'm guessing maybe 400,000 or 500,000 people roughly in the whole rest of it. So it's a hybrid system, this rural urban. In those densely populated areas, that's the part here in green, you can see some of the cities, they have multi-member ridings, but there'd be more representatives because, of course, there's more population. But then what do you do for the rural areas that are less populated? That's the yellow part here. So in our example here, they would still have their single-member ridings, probably the same size as they do right now. But that in itself isn't good enough because it doesn't give you the multiple level of representation, which doesn't lead you to better proportionality. So all we do is the pink part here, the regional top-ups. And in our example, let's say you added 3 regional seats in the north half of the province, 3 here in the south. So all these people here, in Fort McMurray or down like Medicine Hat and so on, they would have their local representative still, their local MP, and then they'd have an extra regional one as well. The people in the cities would just have more basically local representatives. I mean, it's much more smaller area and densely populated. So it gives a bit of that balance. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you have 2 levels of representation, and that helps with your proportionality, of course, when it comes down to the results.
When you're filling out your ballot, are you going to be voting for a regional representative on top of your riding representative?
Yeah, that's how it would work. So I mean, again, it's a hybrid system. The ballot could look different if you're in the rural areas than if you're in the city areas, let's say. That's possible. It comes down to what decided at the end of the day. But if you're in the rural areas, then you're voting for your local, like that 2-sided ballot I showed you there before. So you vote for someone local and then you vote for somebody regional. There's just 2 sides to the ballot. It could be the same. It could be the same if it's in the cities, or maybe they do an STV type thing where it's like the rank ballots and they're transferring the ballots, the votes and stuff like that.
Let's talk about making proportional representation happen in Canada. We talked a little bit about referendums. We talked a little bit about citizens' assembly. The history of proportional representation, trying to make that happen in Canada, is basically we get enough momentum to get a citizens' assembly. The citizens' assembly goes away. They make a recommendation. We'll say mixed member proportional, STV, one of those things. We've had 7 of them. Depends on where you're at. And this is all at the provincial level. And then there's a referendum. So they'll be like, okay, the citizens' assembly says we're going to have this. They want to change it to this. Let's say STV. Let's have a referendum and leave it up to the rest of the people to decide. Even if there's enough people to get that citizens' assembly, say you have 68% of Canadians currently want proportional representation, what are the chances of that referendum going
in our favor?
In the favor of the citizens' assembly?
Well, there's a historical precedent to all this, of course.
So what's the trouble here? Why hasn't this happened?
There's a fundamental challenge in Canada and anywhere else that's trying to change their voting system. It's very hard to convince the people who are elected under a certain system to change the system that got them elected. There's an inherent bias there. And we're at the point now, Fair Vote and electoral activists, that we have to acknowledge that. We can't just kind of ignore that, well, they should kind of have a bigger picture. Like, if that's how you were elected, then that's what you're familiar with, and you know that it works, and it takes a lot of work to convince someone otherwise. We have a few. We have absolutely some champions in all the parties, really, provincial or federal, who say, I was elected on the first past the post. I would rather us change to some kind of proportional representation. But you're always coming up, usually against party leadership and strategists and so on, and they want to keep the status quo because it's what they're used to, and they know how to operate under that, and that's the bias that's inherent to the system. When it comes to referendums, therefore, any referendum on any topic in the history of Canada, it needs a champion from the government. And that could have come from the recommendation, of course, from a citizens' assembly, but a government that stands behind it, that takes a stand, and that's never happened. So we don't have the public education, we don't have the resources, and just like your experience in Ontario in 2007, I saw this in 2009 in British Columbia. People show up at the ballot box and they're like, I didn't even know there was a referendum. Well, what's all this about? How's this going to work? It's overwhelming. It's complicated. Of course they're going to vote no because they don't know what it's about. They haven't been explained. Fair Vote does a lot of great work, but we're a grassroots volunteer organization. We're going door to door, handing out pamphlets, doing webinars. We don't have the kind of resources that the government has to educate the public on making an informed decision. That's the problem with referendums.
Every time I tried to explain, there's a problem with first past the post, here's the mixed member proportional, this is back in like 2007, people would be like, you're starting from very basics, right? You're like, okay, here's the current electoral system, here's why it's unfair, here's how this one, you have to do 3 things, and that takes time. And to do that, every single person is a lot. I think this has been around long enough that people are like, this is ridiculous. I hate having to like hold my nose and vote every single time. I think, but then it comes down to the nitty gritty of which one in particular, and then there's people who like campaign for and against. Like, maybe I want proportional representation, maybe I don't want this proportional representation.
Right. Well, that goes back to the Citizens Assembly, and Fair Vote's really rallied around that the last few years, is because it has accountability. They're everyday average citizens, just like you and I, who are selected randomly and asked if they want to participate. Do they have the time? Can they make that commitment?
It's a little like jury duty, but for policy, is how I describe it really quickly.
Yep. It probably takes a few months. They have meetings with experts and academics and so on who explain the different options, and they go away and study it, and they deliberate amongst themselves. So it's a very democratic and deliberative process with people who don't have that inherent bias. They're just everyday citizens. They agree to do something, to participate, to improve our democracy. At the end of the day, they come back with a recommendation for what they think is the best way forward for Canada. They could recommend the status quo. They could say, first past the post is actually the best. We're pretty confident, and the results show anyway in British Columbia and Ontario and so on, that they're going to recommend some type of proportional representation, because clearly it's more effective, it's more democratic, it's more modern, and all the rest. So at that point, you've had a deliberative process in a citizens' assembly. You have parties who supported the implementation of that assembly in the first place. Now, do we really need another referendum to enact this thing? We need the parties to get together and say, well, great, we're going to act on the recommendations of this accountable citizens' assembly and bring something forward. Why would you have another level of referendum to just complicate things when we have elected representatives to make these decisions in the first place, but we've taken so much of that influence out of their hands in terms of deciding what to do and what kind of system?
The best way forward, it seems, if we want to get this happening in Canada, federally, provincially, whatever the level is to have buy-in from the next government on the idea of letting a citizens' assembly just decide. How's that campaign look like?
Well, it's a good question, because a big part of our work here in Fair Vote, and very much an individual level, is people approaching their local representatives, candidates, and then getting party leadership, going to policy conventions and things like that to get this as part of party policy. We were successful. I guess it's 2 years ago almost now, with the federal Liberals. They agreed and they voted for it, their party members, that bringing in a citizens' assembly is now official Liberal Party Canada party policy. So that's one example. The NDP supported, the Green Party. Of course, we're always working on Conservatives. I mean, this proportional representation benefits everybody across the country. If you're Conservative in downtown Toronto, when are you ever going to get a local MP? Once in a blue moon. This gives you the chance. It's possible. It may be local, it may be regional. Getting in party platforms is a big part of it, and then getting champions when it comes to bringing legislation, getting a bill in place, making sure we get the votes, and we keep working on it. Because we think about elections as far as popular vote, and popular vote turns into the actual vote count in an election. Elections really only come down to seat counts. I mean, that's the thing that should be reflected in polls and CBC and all the kind of latest updates. It's how many seats are these parties going to get? Popular vote is irrelevant. But we think about popular vote. That's how we think about how popular the parties is. If one party is really far ahead, or if they're equal or whatever.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, that has nothing to do with seat count at all.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time. How should people, I think the best way to end is, how should people get involved with Fair Vote? What's the best way?
Start with a website, I suppose, is fairvote.ca. We do have kind of chapters and working groups across the country. If we don't have one where you live, think about starting one. Get a few people together. It doesn't take a lot of effort. The real fundamental message I want to leave people is that this is a grassroots, individual type campaign, and it really makes a difference when people reach out to their MP or a candidate. And I know this from firsthand experience. Like, I've met a lot of MPs over the years, and they say, you know, when people take the effort to call, to write a letter, to come and see me in person, we may not think that we're making much of an impact, but it accumulates, and they really do notice this stuff.
All right, Ted, thank you so much for joining me.
Cheers.